Well howdy, welcome back to my channel. And in this video, we're going to look at one of the big conflicts in early modern world history, namely, the Napoleonic Wars. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so before we dive into the details of Napoleon and his associated wars, we need to understand the broader conflict in which they are situated, namely the long 18th century. Remember that the French Revolution had a profound effect on pretty much all of Europe, not just France. Why? Because the ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and in particular, the overthrow of absolute monarchy were extremely threatening to the various monarchs of Europe who were busy keeping their heads. And so the French Revolution created a conservative reaction in Europe that culminated in a series of conflicts known as the Napoleonic Wars. Now, our buddy Napoleon rose to power in France during the later stages of the French Revolution. And when he came to power, there was a war going on between France and a coalition of European nations. This was the War of the First Coalition, and it was started by the aforementioned conservative powers who did not want the whole French Revolution thing to spread to their countries. And so they went to war against the Sans-Culottes. But the Sans-Culottes were like, whatever dude, and they just kept on partying. And because of this, Napoleon, who was a military genius, mind you, went ahead and conquered much of northern Italy and convinced the other European powers that, hey, maybe we should all be friends. And with that, the War of the First Coalition ended. But then a couple years later, the coalition reformed and went to war against France again, and that became the War of the Second Coalition. But this time, Napoleon was prepared. He met the coalition army head-on and just smashed them. Like the British were part of this coalition, but they didn't have a large force there. So really, Napoleon was a self-made man. That's why the British were able to escape, thus preserving the Royal Navy and ensuring that Britain would be a major player throughout the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. And with the British Navy controlling the seas, the British began a policy of sending missionaries everywhere, which led to the rapid spread of Christianity throughout the world. Just kidding. It was a policy of naval blockades designed to cripple the French economy, and it worked pretty well. The blockade of the British and the economic difficulties they imposed on the French actually led to the downfall of Napoleon. But more on that later. In the meantime, while Napoleon was kicking British butt, he was also conquering much of Central Europe. He even managed to get all the way to Moscow, though he failed to capture the city. And this was for two reasons. First, the scorched earth policy of the Russians as they retreated made it difficult for Napoleon's army to find food. And second, the size of Napoleon's army. His massive army was made up of conscripts from the many nations he had conquered, and they weren't particularly loyal to him. In fact, when they got to Moscow and realized the city wasn't full of treasure, as Napoleon had promised, they got real discouraged. But perhaps most importantly, while Napoleon was away, the British took the opportunity to invade and occupy southern and southwestern France. And so Napoleon returned to France, and instead of dealing with the British, he went to work securing his hold on power in France. And he did many good things for France, like establishing a strong centralized state, instituting the metric system, and creating a legal code that was based on Enlightenment principles. However, he also caused some distress among the peasants by taking their land and giving it to landless nobles. And this created a significant obstacle to the widespread adoption of capitalism in France, because you couldn't have capitalism without land ownership being concentrated in the hands of a few. But regardless, after 10 years of warfare, the exhausted French people were ready to put the whole revolution and Napoleonic era behind them. And so in 1814, they went ahead and kicked Napoleon's royal butt and sent him off to exile on the island of Elba. However, after a brief abdication, Napoleon escaped and returned to France and took up arms once more. This period is sometimes called the 100 Days' War, and at the end of it, Napoleon met his match at the Battle of Waterloo. So the victorious powers assembled a Congress of Vienna, whose purpose was to redraw the map of Europe to prevent future wars. They sought to do this in three ways. First, they established a balance of power among the great powers of Europe. Second, they surrounded France with a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone of friendly nations. And third, they sought to restore the royal families that had been deposed during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, click here if you want to keep reviewing for Unit 6. And I am glad we got to hang out for a few minutes, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Signing out.